Let's go ahead and get started. There are a couple of things we're going to be looking at that do have like smaller fonts to them. So if you would like to move up a little bit, it might make your experience a bit more comprehensive, I would say. So first I'll introduce myself. My name is Jaci Wilkinson. I'm an assistant professor and the web services librarian at the University of Montana in the Mansfield Library. I've been working there only since October, so I'm a new addition to the Missoula community. So we're going to be talking about tonight not only the rise of what we call fake news, which we'll even talk about like what some of these terms mean that get thrown around to describe news that has, untold bias in it. We're also going to talk about ways that you can directly take action if you have experiences with news or online content that you want to investigate and or talk about or share more fully with your networks that you're involved with online, because I do think that that is an important part of this process. It takes people sharing content and sharing viewpoints for ideas, both good and bad, to spread. So some of the questions that we're going to ask today, and I'm going to try to clock us in at like under 45 minutes, so plenty of time for questions or individual questions if anyone wants to hang around. So what is fake news, and how do I personally identify it, and how do I want to consider something fake news, right? We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between hate speech and fake news. That's something that's been coming up a lot with the rise of extremism and trolling and online content, and it's a really fascinating discussion. So we're also going to talk about the psychology of fake news and online content. Sometimes we ask ourselves, why do people believe this stuff? Why do people share it? We'll look at a story with incredulity and wonder how anyone could have believed it. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why people get sucked into content that is not very believable to maybe other people. So again, the component, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can be proactive in fighting fake news, and then we're going to talk about why a librarian such as myself cares about fake news. So a little pre-test to start. Some of this font is a little small, so I'll read it for you. This is a screenshot from a test that over 1,000 middle schoolers took as part of a Stanford history group study. They went all over the country and administered a test to determine the, what is it they call it? The civic online reasoning of students, which is a term that I really like because I think it goes against this idea of good and bad and fake and untruthful news, this idea of civil online civic reasoning. So the question that they asked is, the following tweet appears in your feed, and here's the tweet here. What about this tweet could be useful information about NRI members' opinions on background checks, and list any sources you use to make your decision. So students were allowed to do research to make their decision on this particular question. And then conversely, why might this not be a useful source of information on NRI members' opinions on background checks? So the tweet we're looking at, if you can see here, it's from an organization called MoveOn.org, and it says that 2 out of 3 gun owners say they would be more likely to vote for a candidate who supported background checks. Why might this be not a very useful piece of information on NRA's members and opinions on background checks?
Well, it all depends on the population surveyed.
Yeah, there's no sort of contextual information given about the survey size, how many people, what part of did they focus on a certain part of the country. None of that information is provided. And that's in large part due to the medium. It's a tweet. You have a character limit, and then you can embed some sort of image or link, and that's about it. So the medium itself constrains the information we can be given. Second of all, this is really small, so I'm just going to go ahead and point this out. There is a little bit of citing to this tweet. So if someone were to pick up on, okay, what is this CAP organization? Which the survey found that by and large, students did not do any research into the organization itself that did the survey. But if they were to, they would see that CAP is called Citizens for something about progress. Let's look it up real quick. I forget off the top of my head. American Pathologists.
Right. I remember.
Center for American Progress. So even if someone is looking at this tweet and trying to decide whether or not it's useful, if they don't know what CAP stands for and where CAP is coming from with their survey, it's very hard to qualify how useful this source is to tell us actual NRA members' opinions on background checks. So I want to show you a couple of the responses because I think this is really interesting, digging into some of the answers of all these survey questions. And the executive report is freely available online. And I'm going to show you just this question real quick. Sorry about all the scrolling. It makes me nauseous too. I'm sorry. So, and I highly recommend you take a look at this too if you have kids or grandkids, or if you're an educator. This is a really great way to have a discussion with them about evaluating online content. And you can gamify it, sort of in the same way that I've done just now, to have a discussion with us of using these questions and then having a discussion with someone about the answer of them. So some of the information that students picked out, they picked out of the thousands of respondents, students who had a mastery of mastery of understanding why or why not, of answering the question, and then emerging and beginning. And so I wanted to share some of the beginning ones. So the student equates Twitter followers with trustworthiness. MoveOn.org has a large following on Twitter. That is obviously not a very good metric for trustworthiness, is how many followers you have on Twitter. So another respondent said it could be useful because a graphic with a strong message can be enlightening or more likely thought-provoking. So someone focused on the tweet's appearance rather than seeking to do any research or background information as to the content of it. So again, people were getting caught up in the medium of it. So, and just to give us a counter example, they also explain in the survey what mastery, what a correct response would have demonstrated. Someone fully explaining how the political motivations of the organizations involved might influence the content of the tweet. For instance, NRA is known to be very conservative politically, known to vote for Republicans by and large, whereas CAP is an organization that considers itself very progressive and by and large, although it is not partisan, tends to support issues that are democratic or part of the Democratic Party platform. So already we're starting to see that the medium, as well as the content and the inability to focus on content, is a big part of the process of why evaluating content online is very difficult, particularly for young people. And which I'm going to stop right there too. I'm going to say particularly for young people and stop there because I think a lot of us have presume that young people or people who are growing up as quote unquote digital natives, being exposed to this from a very young age, have a better grasp on evaluating this type of content and understanding it. And that is simply not true. I very much fight against the label of digital native. Just because this is something that students grow up with, it does not mean that psychologically our young people are hardwired to understand and intake information differently. Come in if you'd like.
Are we in the right place?
This is the Fight Fake News workshop. All right. So now that we've done a little pre-test just to get our juices flowing, let's talk a little bit about how, when I'm throwing the word around of fake news, what I sort of mean. And I mean a lack of transparency and accountability, attribution, and a lack of citing experts. So, and that generally goes along with lots of outrage and extremist viewpoints. And I think this is something that people forget about a lot. Unclear timelines in a news story, particularly a piece of journalism that seems to be telling a story and showing something chronologically, but sort of jumps around and doesn't necessarily say who their sources are or use a lot of unidentified sources. I've included a link here. The American Press Institute is doing some really great work right now, as are a lot of press and journalist organizations, to grapple with these ideas of civic online reasoning and how to make sure that the public feels like they can trust journalists, because there is definitely a trust issue going on, I think, between the media and people who read the news like ourselves and use it to make decisions about day-to-day things and our political viewpoints. There's also an excellent TED Talk that I've been using, and we're not going to watch any of it, but I did want to draw your attention to it if you want to write it down. It's by Damon Brown, who is a journalist and professor. And yeah, almost 300,000 views. That's not bad, especially. Oh, that's sort of old. So this is a TED Talk I recommend looking at if you like listening or watching things instead of just reading it. So again, I'm going to go back and forth between talking about things as fake news and talking about the behaviors we use to evaluate, like fake news or things that we want to consider legitimate news sources, as civic online reasoning. So hopefully you're going to come out of today feeling like you have a better understanding of how to partake in civic online reasoning to choose information sources that best fit the information and questions that you have and the information you're seeking to find. And I think sometimes we forget that fake news isn't new. A lot of people have been talking about this and saying, well, fake news isn't new, and they point to yellow journalism. Yellow journalism in the 19th century was something that arose that goaded us into the Spanish-American War. But in fact, I find it to be a much more compelling comparison to talk about a lot of the fake news and the falsehoods that were tragically spread about African Americans in the North and the South, but particularly in the South, when there was such a fear, particularly in the leading up to the Civil War, the fear of slave revolt. Slave revolts were actually very uncommon, but stories and coverage of Native American African American slave revolts and uprisings and crimes were widely misreported. And there was even such crazy stories as of African Americans spontaneously turning white. And the thing that these stories tell us is more about the psychology of the people spreading this type of incredibly incorrect content, less so than the content itself. And so there's a really cool resource called The Long and Brutal History of Fake News. This is from Politico, that I think does a really great job of talking more about this, and with some of the issues are similar to our own. Inaccuracies and falsehoods spread about immigrants, spread about people of color, those resonate into our present day. And they are definitely not new in our history. Yeah?
Would you say that fake news and urban legends are the same thing, more or less?
No. So urban legends are things that arise that have sort of take a cultural hold and somewhat transcend a place and time. Like the whole Sasquatch myth has a lot. The thing that defines it there are all these characteristics that have stayed the same over time, and people that are still seeking the truth. Even though there isn't a lot of evidence that suggests it's correct. I'm saying that fake news is a lot more everyday and a lot more insidious in its everydayness and the way that it works its way into other content that we might be reading online. Because again, because of the medium that we consume so much of our information on anymore, things are presented as all the same. You could be on a New York Times article, and there could be a link at the bottom of that article of ad content that will take you to completely misleading content that you would never choose. But it's presented right alongside your New York Times article. So this idea that there's a flat plane makes our daily interactions with information on the internet just a lot more convoluted than the way it's presented. Does that answer your question a little bit? We can talk more about that later, too. So, okay, so this leads into it really well. A couple of other specific reasons authors and originators of content can be difficult to pinpoint. Things get shared so easily, it's so easy to copy and paste things on your computer, and it doesn't paste anything else except for that content that you copied. Videos are very easy to make into a screenshot, so it's into an image. So, and there's a lot of instances of news being misreported because people take a video and take screenshots out of them and make them into images and claim that they are something else. And I'll have an example of that later. Images and videos, again, are really easy to reuse and to share without permission, and to cut and paste little bits of video and to mush them together in a way that tells a different story, perhaps, than it originally was meant to depict. And information is shared on platforms without, well, I guess I've already said this, without attribution. And I want to show you an example of a very fun example. So BuzzFeed is really famous for its like 21 blah that will do blah, or like 21 reasons you know you're a Virgo living in the Midwest. Just crazy stuff. But it really gets to people because, and this is very clickable content, BuzzFeed has it down when it comes to writing like an amazing piece of clickbait to get you here. But I want to show you some of these photos that they use. Okay, so this has an attribution. And does this have an attribution? This one has an attribution. But this one has a link. This one is about some dudes rescuing a sheep out of the ocean, which is adorable. But okay, now here's a great example. There's no link that tells you where this came from. Who knows where these photos came from? They could have just as easily been throwing a sheep into the water, and that's an exaggeration, and I definitely don't wish that happened. But BuzzFeed makes it very easy to tell a very certain story about this grouping of images that there's just no information that substantiates them. So that one has an attribute. Let's find one more. Okay, here's a great example of just a screenshot. So who knows where this poll came from or where it originated, and if it really even existed. Someone could use graphic design to just create all of these like different numbers and bars and put them together in a document and share them online. But it is a very cute article, and it did restore my faith in humanity, so who knows, maybe it's problematic, but I loved it. So, and here's a really big thing, sponsored content and ads made to look like news content. This is a really funny one. I was a guest lecturer in an analytics marketing class a couple of weeks ago. And a big thing that upcoming marketers and advertisers are being taught to do is to create sponsored content and ads, to make sponsored content and ads look exactly like any other news article, except it just happens to be a narrative that's written with money sponsored from an advertiser. So a really excellent example of that is in our executive summary. I'm sorry to scroll again. This will be the last time, I promise. So here is a screenshot from the front page of Slate. And they asked students to identify which of these blocks were sponsored content. 80% of respondents could not tell that this box right here was an advertisement. The analytics marketing students, when I told them this, they flipped. They like could not believe it. And they went after the students. They're like, well, these students didn't have very good critical thinking skills. I mean, we don't know what school they were from. It was like, they were not pleased with this because this is exactly the type of content that advertisers and marketers are finding most lucrative these days, because they make their money even if you just click on this. You do not even have to purchase anything once you get onto this page. The clicks themselves and the data that is collected from you in the process of clicking is making them money. So, and that's a whole other topic that we could go into. That was something we talked more about at my workshop last week. So even the word sponsored content, students were not identifying them as an advertisement. And so I'm going to go back to that slide, but this is hard to read. But the question I pose is, what does it mean for the middle schoolers who should be taught the definition of sponsored content before they're in middle school? When they're in elementary school, those are concepts that they need to be taught, whether it be in the home or in the schools. And consider that in comparison with our figures that we still have on the digital divide and who has internet in their homes and who just accesses internet on a smartphone. Some of our kids are still growing up not having regular access to internet. Fortunately, we have public libraries that do a really great job at providing equal access to all members of the community free of charge, but it's still not the same as being connected in the way that students and young people in higher socioeconomic brackets have access to this type of content. So not only are some students not being educated in the ways of how to engage in civic online reasoning, these are students that are oftentimes already in a socioeconomic bracket that puts them, that makes them a vulnerable population already. They're more likely to not finish high school. They're more likely to get a minimum wage job. So there's a whole lot of other factors that come out when students and when our young people are not exposed to the internet in a healthy way and taught how to engage in civic online reasoning from a young age. So something that we're also discovering is that extreme viewpoints are fed to us much more readily than counter viewpoints from our own or moderating viewpoints from our own. An example of this is YouTube. So a scholar at UNC, an information scientist, her name is Zeynep Tufekci. Took me a long time to get that name down. But she is absolutely wonderful. And so this is a really great interview that she did, this was just a couple months ago, about research that she's been doing recently on YouTube algorithms. Whenever you watch a YouTube video, and we can look right here, you watch a video and then you are suggested other videos to watch. And from studying the algorithms that sit behind YouTube and decide which content to push to you next, Tufekci is discovering that it is more extremist viewpoints that match viewpoints that the algorithms already think you have based on content that you're already watching. So an example that she uses in this interview with Scott Simon is if you were looking for historic coverage on 9/11, some of the next videos that are going to show up in your Watch Next category are about 9/11, debunking 9/11 and how 9/11 didn't happen or 9/11 was orchestrated by the government. So it's immediately taking you from something that might not have been political in the first place and bringing it into a very extremist political place. And unfortunately, we already know what the repercussions of these types of algorithms are. The Southern Poverty Law Center made an excellent and heart-wrenching video called The Miseducation of Dylan Roof, who was the young man who to this day remains remorseless about entering a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdering 9 people, 9 African Americans. And through footage and through investigative material about Dylann Roof's online activity that he was engaging in the years preceding this horrific act, investigators were essentially able to map out his radicalization process by finding the Google searches that he did that increasingly led him to more extreme content with completely incorrect statistics about crime in African Americans and lots of Aryan race content. It's just absolutely heart-wrenching. We're not going to watch this here. It is very unsettling, but I highly recommend you take a look at it. Again, if you have a teenager in your life, and I know they're going to hate you for it, share this with them. I'm trying to share it with as many young people that are in my life in an age-appropriate way, teenagers, because we are letting some of our young people fall through the cracks when we don't teach about civic online reasoning. Yeah.
But you know what, I think this is actually a good opportunity, what you're talking about, because we've been letting those people fall through the cracks for generations. We don't teach critical thinking at all in this society, and we're constantly bombarded by advertising, even if we're not online. So it's good for people to start thinking about this, online or not.
I completely agree, and that's an excellent point. Yeah, this type of extremist and terrorist activity has obviously always been there, and especially in our country, particularly heinous acts against people of color, the LGBTQ community, the Native community, has always existed, but we're just seeing it in a new way that it's interesting how it makes it easier for us to study it now, because we have all of this in one place, and we have these algorithms sitting on the back end that are possible for us to study, to see how these behaviors happen, and how they lead from A to B to Dylann Roof. Yeah?
So how do the algorithms get there on YouTube? Who's in charge of the algorithm?
That's Google. So Google owns YouTube, and that's about as much as we know. Algorithms are trade secrets, so those are under lock and key.
Somebody puts this stuff in place. I mean, somebody's responsible at Google then for the algorithms that select this extreme material.
Exactly. And I want to clarify something that you said there. There is not one person directly responsible for making sure these 3 videos are situated next to this. Someone is responsible, or more likely a team of people, are responsible for coding the algorithm that makes all of this appear. So, and I think that sometimes that's something that people do not understand, is how hands-off our algorithms are at this point, and even to the extent of another Zeynep Tufekci issue is machine-based learning. We now know how to code algorithms that know how to learn. She has a TED Talk about machine-based learning. I forget the title off the top of my head, but I'd be more than happy to share it with anyone afterwards. A friend of hers, this is just an example of how algorithms engage in machine learning. A friend of hers created an algorithm that was able to learn and predict the likelihood of someone being clinically diagnosed with depression within the next year, just through analyzing social media posts and demographic details that came in through social media. And then she talked about that. On the other hand, machine learning algorithms are being inserted into everyday things like HR software that's siphoning through people's applications, people's cover letters. It's only a matter of time before these types of algorithms could potentially come together. And then we have on our hands cover letters that are indicating how likely someone is to develop depression in the next year, and algorithms weeding out those candidates without the HR people even knowing what's going on. So, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily happening right now, but that is just only a logical progression of how this type of algorithmic behavior is so interwoven into our lives now. Does that answer your question?
That's depressing.
It's depressing, but it's better to know about it, I guess is my, I brought up that example in my last workshop and I said 90% of the people that attend this workshop are 70% more likely to be diagnosed with depression after seeing all this information, which is very dark, I'm sorry to say. So I'm going to skim over this a little bit. I do want to point out that the Pew Research Foundation is doing really excellent demographic work. And what's that?
I really like them. I read their stuff a lot.
Yeah, they have excellent articles.
They focus on people's beliefs and what they believe in.
Yeah, and they have a whole section on the internet and technology and society. And it's called pewinternet.org. And it's not just, so it'll be data sets, so things where you can go in and download the data yourself and play around with it. Or it could be things like fact sheets where it's very visually appealing presented data, or interactives or presentations or publications. So there's a lot of different ways to consume the information that they are always collecting about the American public and their opinions and how they engage with different parts of society. Yeah?
You may be going to address this question later, but I'm just going to ask it. Can you save yourself from being chewed up and spit out by one of these algorithms if you use that private browsing choice option?
To an extent, you can protect yourself from having your data read by some algorithms if you do things like if you have a cookie blocker, if you use like a browser that hides your IP address, Tor is an example. Your internet service provider is always collecting this data on you and selling it to marketers and advertisers. So you can do something like set up a VPN, which in essence takes your IP address and instead of your internet service provider reading it, it goes to a different server. That's the VPN. But then your issue with the VPN is then the VPN knows all the information. So a free VPN is usually not the most secure. So there are a lot of different things like that. I'd be happy to go over more of those with you or with any of you individually after this. Yeah?
Yeah, this is not a defense of the algorithms or anything, but they work for good as well as evil. If you take up a new hobby, archery or something, you go on YouTube and get a couple how-to videos, then you'll be bombarded with a lot of other related content. So outside the political spectrum, it works real well. I think in terms of the political spectrum, it works towards confirmation bias.
Yes, and that's an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up and breaking us out of our political bubble a little bit, because that's a great point. There's a quote that I used in my last lecture that said, actually, let's just navigate to that. All of my curriculum materials from today and from my workshop last week, which was about privacy online, it's on my website, JaciPaigeWilkinson.blog. If you want to write that down, all of this information is freely available if you want to view it after today. But there's a really great quote that I'm glad you brought that up. Because it makes me... Truthina, yeah. We could talk about that too. I'm sorry. Oh, you know what? This is from the wrong lecture. That was actually from my marketing analytics class lecture last week. So if you could go down and look at that too. Nothing inherent in technology, there's nothing inherent in technology that requires it to be so invasive and privacy reducing. Corporations and the state have made it so. So these algorithms, I think you're correct. There's some really excellent things about them. It's who is wielding the power of them and what are the checks and balances systems for the power that algorithm gives. So again, Pew Internet, I like to show this as well. Again, my marketing analytics students were actually dumbfounded. 15% of Americans don't use the internet at all. So and 44% of Americans age 65 and older do not use the internet at all. And that only 17% of adults 50 to 64 don't use the internet. So that's a huge gap after 65. it really drops off. So, and then there's also an education gap there, and a racial gap. So 24% of Hispanics, so 24% of Hispanics don't use the internet. And I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there of how much content, especially if they're living in this country, how much content is available to them in Spanish, or are they seeking to translate it with Google Translate to read it in Spanish? How are they using that content? 20% of rural residents say they do not use the internet. So, and what we're seeing is that this gap, this digital divide, is going to get smaller and smaller. But the new gap that is arising is the difference between people who have access to like broadband and a computer and people who just have access to internet via a smartphone, which is really problematic because the types of things that are available on your smartphone are very limited. For instance, a job application. For instance, any type of form that you want to fill out online. The web is by and large still not very responsive, and therefore the people most often left out are, in our country, people who are not white, people who are younger and with less education, and people in a lower socioeconomic demographic. So it's great to remind ourselves, those of us who have the opportunity to be online quite a bit, that that is still not a reality for a lot of Americans. Another thing I want to bring up is the gender gap online. For instance, so Wikipedia, the amount of people who are editors on Wikipedia is overwhelmingly male. Overwhelmingly.
But isn't that a self-selected group?
It is a self-selected group. But whether or not it's a self-selected group, what impact does that have on the content? And I think the argument that's being made, and this is something that libraries and academic institutions are taking part in, they're having wikithons, and we're trying to fill up Wikipedia with more leveled content, especially with regards to notable historic female figures, because those are often the figures that are less written about in history and are less well known by the predominantly male editors. So these things just sort of become like an echo chamber of like, okay, so we only have white male editors. Okay, so we only have white males represented and written about on Wikipedia. And that becomes a cycle of when we don't see representation in places like Wikipedia, less non-white males will want to be on Wikipedia or finding information on Wikipedia. Or they won't want to become a scientist because they don't see like any Native American women scientists on Wikipedia, which is predominantly the place that like our young people are getting their content, whether I like it or not. Okay. So, okay, to move into this next portion, we'll go through this really quick. There's a pretty good New Yorker article, and what it does is talks about academic articles, and it provides full text to academic articles, which is difficult because often academic articles are limited to people who have access to them through an institutional login. So we create a huge barrier between people who have access to academic level knowledge and those who don't by whether or not they work for an academic institution or are students in that institution. So these are all academic articles that go about explaining psychology of a lot of the behaviors that I think some Americans, not all, have been somewhat puzzled by in the past 6 or 7 months with our recent presidential election and the rise of more extremist views and trolling online. So I highly recommend taking a look at this New Yorker article and taking a look around these academic papers to see if any of these things are ringing true for you, because these are not things that the popular press is talking about. These are much more in-depth and specific in most cases, but it sort of is a palate cleanser to read these academic articles and how they talk about group psychology. But at the same time, I could talk about all day. I could give you a list of news sources I think we all should read because they're the best ones, or even academic journals that I think are the best ones that we should all be reading. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really prove a point to anything because there's no such thing as unbiased content. And this is one of the key points of information literacy that we teach, is that information, authority is constructed and contextual. So whether we're talking about like a news source like The Blaze that is called conservative, or Slate, which is called like very liberal by this particular infographic, we still saw that example of sponsored content. That's not a very good example of civic online behavior undergone by the editorial press of Slate. So be wary of anyone that tries to tell you that one news source is unbiased or one news source is the best, because it's still up to us at the end of the day to go through the process of vetting an article or a piece of information ourselves, not just using a brand name or an article title or even an author's name just to feed us whether or not we think that's a good piece of content. And this is a chart that went really viral after the election and featured on a lot of different places online, and librarians really went to town on this to say, wait, this graph misses the point. And that's what I'm trying to impress on you as well.
What's the vertical graph on that? That has a line that is rated according to you. I just can't quite make it.
No, it's just part of, okay, sensational or clickbait versus basic as F, which is, I'm not going to explain what as F is. Merit meets high standards, analytical, and complex.
Okay.
So which even, like, this graph is very interesting because look at where they put all of the conservative sources. They put all of the conservative sources in this clickbait, not very complex. There's not any of these very conservative sources that are called complex. And that in and of itself, I think, displays a lot of bias on the part of the person who created this graph. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm not used to pointing that part out. But you can see, like, The Economist and The Hill are some of these ones that are considered like more complex and like farther from moderate. And adding another layer to this is the rise of think tanks. So we talked about CAP earlier, for Citizens for American Progress, but we also have found, and that is admittedly a very progressive organization, but we also have organizations like the Heritage Foundation. And when you go to the websites of these institutes and you look at sort of their findings or the reports that they're writing, it looks a lot like the Pew Research Group. It doesn't look like a news source. It is trying to display itself as being more research-oriented, more unbiased, and relying more on information. But these think tanks still have political bias, and they look at information in a very particular way, and they draw conclusions from the data that they collect in a very particular way. So not even our think tanks are safe. I mean, even the Pew Research Group, that is definitely a source I've been recommending to you all, but we can't just turn off our civic online reasoning, even when we're reading a Pew Research report. This is what I've been talking about. I have a couple of, so for those of you who want to really be snoopy and really want to get into it, ICANWHOIS is a way to identify the domain name holders and addresses of people that own a website. So say you find a website, or you can link an article back to the website that you've never seen before. Oftentimes you can identify who owns that domain name through ICANWHOIS. Organizations are getting better and better at having them unlisted, but it's still sort of fun to try out. And I don't know how to pronounce this. I think it's Snoops, but it looks like Snopes. Snopes, have you heard it pronounced? It's a really fun place. Again, it relies on crowdsourcing. It doesn't have like an editorial board or authors, but people just go there and say, like, is this article a hoax, or is this thing that happened a hoax? And people like weigh in on it. So if you feel like you're crazy and you're reading something, you're like, I have no idea what this thing is going on about, go to Snopes, see what other people are talking about, and see if other people are linking to other articles. The crowdsourced information sometimes looks the craziest and looks the least reputable, but sometimes those are where you find the hidden gems. The conversation is a news source that not a lot of people know about, but I've been trying to promote a lot when I talk to people, particularly if people are asking, like, where's a good place to find news that I haven't heard of before? Again, I would say just from reading the conversation, it does have definitely a liberal political or progressive political bent, and that comes from most of its authors are academics. Most of them are professors at universities, which are individuals who are more likely than not tend to be liberal or progressive. But I find it really interesting how they talk about the author. So this person is a research fellow at the University of Oxford, gives a disclosure statement, gives a partner. So it says straight up, the organization that this author is associated with gives money to the conversation. And 6 easy ways to tell if that viral story is a hoax. What is the foundation of where this curriculum comes from? So if you want to find some more information about what I've been talking about today and find ways to be snoopier, find ways to add more journalistic vigor to your information seeking online, I highly recommend you check out this article. So, is fake news protected speech? An article in November was published in Bloomberg that argued, I think it was a lawyer, someone with a law degree who works for Bloomberg, arguing that fake news might not be protected speech. What do y'all think about that?
I'd have to read the article. It sounds like a stretch.
I think you're right. Yeah.
The new piece, it seems to me, in my fairly long life, that I'm seeing is that when something is repeated and repeated ad nauseum, with great passion and great conviction, and then you hear your friends and associates repeating those exact same words with that same passion and conviction, you wonder if it has morphed into propaganda, and you begin to think about inciting to riot. And so it seems, I feel that we're at a very fragile place in our country with the way in which we deliver this kind of material. I don't even want to call it news. It's like a cancerous spin-off of the news. But it is infecting so many people. I'm sure that any of us have family members who are susceptible to this, listen to it almost exclusively. It seems to me that their minds are being contorted, twisted in a way. On the one hand, you want to give people the benefit of thinking for themselves. On the other hand, you know full well that human nature in many of us is errs on the side of the passionate. And the worse it is, the more passionate we can become about it. Can a civilization exist turning its back on the very negative impact of that while fighting to the death over freedom of speech?
I think that's a very...
Go down while we're holding
Yeah.
the flag for freedom of speech aloft.
I think that is a very eloquent counterpoint. So the argument that this article makes, if I can bring it up, is similar to your own. The ideas of the Bill of Rights and the freedom of speech were, oh darn it. I will have to not keep that up. The idea of free speech is somewhat based around the same construct as that of the free market. that there is a marketplace where all things being equal is the key component to content being shared and disseminated and consumed by individuals. And the argument that this author makes is that it is no longer a free market that information exists on. I think precisely for the reasons you say, we have this echo chamber that we create for ourselves of very extremist messages. And when we hear these messages over and over, it is simply psychology that we start to believe them and they start to embed themselves into us, especially if we're surrounded from them and can't escape them. For those of us who work and have to live in front of a computer for 8 hours a day, it's difficult to come out of that chamber, that echo chamber of content. So he makes the argument that things are not equal anymore, and so we need to re-level the playing field for content that has been vetted in a certain way. And my caveat that I put into that is, how would anti-fake news laws be enforced, and who would do the enforcing? Because it's there that we start to see the potential for extreme abuse of powers. Again, these technologies in and of themselves are not corruptive. It's the organizations that have control of them that are corrupted. So if our government decided to punish certain people for what they labeled fake news, it would be very easy then for that label to be molded along the lines of whatever type of administration or whatever type of organization was in power. So if we had a very liberal administration, fake news laws would be applied more harshly on conservative news sources and vice versa. I also want to point out that it's a slippery slope, and it is, so this is a very big thing about the ALA, that the ALA has been, and the ACLU have been at the forefront of intellectual freedom. So, and that's connecting the idea that your First Amendment rights are connected directly to a right to consume and produce information. So we have fought such things as pornography laws. For instance, the computers here, software was developed to prevent people from looking at pornography on public library computers. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was unlawful, because the second you put that type of software on these computers, it also blocked websites on breastfeeding. So not only was it heavy-handed software, there also were definitely these slippery slope lines where there's some content that people would consider to be pornography, and some content that people would consider to be very unharmful or educational. Another example of types of content that is often blocked by that type of software, which is used in school libraries frequently, is like LGBTQ materials. So students who are researching LGBTQ issues, oftentimes that software will just block any of that content. So I really like, that is a brilliant argument, but at the end of the day, I still come on the line, I still come down on the side of fake news, or anything that we want to consider fake news, is protected speech. Unfortunately, it just makes it harder for us, and it puts a much larger burden on all of us to vet the information that we not only consume, but that we share. So the director of the Intellectual Freedom Office has a really great quote from an interview he did of, "Anything you want us to be quiet about, let's talk about that." So oftentimes these issues, when fake news becomes, and people want to suppress certain types of content, it's because it's really very politically contentious stuff. And these are things that we need to be having conversations in our communities about, non-violent, ethical conversations and debates, not repressing conversation about those topics. So, and that extends to hate speech. You know, there is a really great resource that the ACLU has that talks about hate speech on college campuses. Oh, shucks. Yes. So particularly college campuses have asked for the First Amendment to be somewhat curbed to prevent violence and verbal abuse towards populations, particularly like sensitive populations like people of color, the LGBTQ community, and other what they call historically persecuted groups. And this has been an issue of contention, and even on the University of Montana, we have a free speech zone. And this is very problematic, and I would contend technically not legal. But it is a way for the campus that we work on to contain discussions and demonstrations to a certain area. So I highly recommend you taking a look more at what hate speech is, because it is becoming an increasingly fine line of the difference between hate acts and hate speech, particularly with the rise of like trolling online and people doing like really horrendous things just in writing and sometimes anonymously to other people online, particularly on Twitter, on Facebook. And again, we've seen a lot of like individual like vigilantism to rise up and to figure out who these people participating in hateful activity are and to unmask them, oftentimes to their employers. And there has also been increased pressure on corporations, such as Twitter, to have a more heavy-handed policy when something is flagged as hate speech or hate content. And I also fight against that a little bit, because I really do not think, corporations do not have ethical responsibilities to the citizens of our country. Corporations exist to make money. So for us to put these types of responsibilities on them is simply incompatible with their functions. And not only will they fight that, I don't think they'll do it incredibly well. So I really do fight back when people say, oh, Facebook should be doing this better, Twitter should be doing this better, they should be on this. Because I think we're not looking at the real problem when we look at just the platform. So that is...
Corporations do exist to make money, but they also exist at the behest of the citizens. So for instance, when a major oil company, Exxon or any of the others, goes to the state of Montana to be incorporated, it's at the permission of the citizens. So they are entering a social sphere as well as a make money sphere. And that's where I would contend that they have, yes, they've been given the right to make money in this state, but they have, if not an equal responsibility, they have a responsibility to the communal good. And they are supposed to create, as a result of being given this permission, they are supposed to create community good. That's in their charters, every single one of them. So could you revise what you just said to indicate maybe what the social responsibility of the corporation might look like?
I think that's a really excellent example, because we do have some very highly regulated industries in our country, like the energy industry, like the television, like broadcasting industry. And more people are seeking for things that exist online to be more heavily regulated by the FCC, because that is the logical regulatory organization that would govern activity like that. The new administration is very much deregulating the FCC as opposed to the Obama administration. And that is definitely something to be keeping an eye on, as activities in the FCC, if you're concerned about issues like this. I would agree with you, and I think you provide, the very logical, like, structural argument for how corporations that work in technology would exist in a way that makes them more accountable to the American public. The question is, would that ever be considered by whatever governmental powers would have to take that responsibility on? And this makes me think of a really excellent keynote speech from a data science conference called Strata in DeHoop. It's called Haunted by Data. And it's fascinating because it is a data scientist who is preeminent in his field going and keynoting at the data science conference in the country and saying, we need to do better without the algorithms we're creating and with our ethics and how we collect data on the citizens of this country, or eventually the government will do it for us. And so there's the argument right there, is if that leads up to, I think, where you're at. It only takes one huge PR crisis of like major data mismanagement, and we're already getting there. We see data leaks happening and people's information being exposed and then being used nefariously almost immediately thereafter when hackers get into servers that have so much data on individuals. And at what point does the citizenry make enough hoopla when something like that happens to make the government say, okay, y'all aren't doing a good job on your own, we need to regulate you further? So that's where that connection comes in, is we as a citizenry have to recognize and understand that we have a part in making sure the government regulates that industry further. And it's just a very complex issue. Speaking about technology in any sort of depth is very difficult, and that's the argument that this data scientist makes, is that he says, the government doesn't know about what we do. They would be struggling, so they would make regulations that wouldn't fit us well. So if we have better behavior and we self-regulate, then we don't have to bring them into the process. So I think that's a really excellent point, and maybe we're moving in that direction as far as regulation. So that is about all I have for you today, and we are at overtime. I'm sorry. My screen went blank, so this is not what I intended for the last slide to be for you all. But I'm sure. Okay, so these are my couple of last slides. How do we fight back? And this is just an example of a Facebook post. You can't read any of this, I'm sorry. This is a silly idea. But I saw a bunch of my friends, like my super liberal, woke friends online, sharing a map and saying, like, we need to redraw the United States maps with boundaries that use better designations and delineations of like who actually owns the land, because we took native land, right? So like pro-native land rights. The problem was everyone that was sharing this map was doing so without any attribution. No one had any idea where this map was coming from. It just came from some article that really like got people riled up about native land rights and really appealed to liberal sentiment. And so I pretty much got on Facebook and said, like, y'all, this is all fine and good, but you need to cite your sources. We need to know what we're talking about here before we just go into a frothy frenzy about a map. Like, I had probably 10 friends share this one map with like a very strong statement. And it's that echo chamber. People got it into their minds, like, yeah, this is important. Yeah, I need to demonstrate that I'm for native land rights. And here we are sharing this like piece of information that could be junk for all we know. So that's just my takeaway. So think about some ways where you could be doing that, and some ways that you engage online. If nothing else, it will make you start to look at the things that you engage with online a little bit differently. We don't really have time for that. This is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. If you would like to do some of these things that we were talking about earlier to help prevent your data from making its way to advertisers and marketers, I highly recommend you check out this set of resources. They have really great step-by-step tutorials if you want to set some of these protective measures up on your appliances, whether it be your phone or your computer. And if you have questions about this, I'm more than happy to stay afterwards and talk more. Classrooms, just like every part of a democracy, are vital locations for controversy and discussion. And that's why I'm here today, because as a librarian, I think that we're not having this discussion enough at like what the true root of some of the issues that are happening in our population. We're so divided as a people. And sometimes I feel like people just are not talking to each other. And I think if we see how the information we consume is sometimes this horrendous kindling to really divisive extremist viewpoints, I think that can help us identify how to be, how to come to the table and talk with people who have different viewpoints than us. So that's it. Thank you so much for being here. If you have any questions, come at me.